There is a moment when stopping the act of desiring changes everything. Neville Goddard taught that the future is not created by waiting. It is occupied by assuming a state now. In this video, you will understand a practical path to inhabiting your future self today, not as empty imagination, but as conscious identity, the kind that transforms relationships, finances, and health from the inside out. If this resonates with you, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this shift, and subscribe to the channel. Because from this point forward, you do not learn how to wait, you learn how to be. The future is not ahead of you, it is accessible. Most people believe the future is something reached through effort, time, and favorable circumstances. This belief creates a dangerous separation between who you are now and who you want to be. Neville Goddard explains that this distance is not real. It is only a mental state. The future is not somewhere far along the timeline. It exists as an available state within consciousness. What appears as waiting is simply remaining in an old state. When you say one day I will have, you are declaring that you are not yet. This assumption keeps the desire always ahead, always something to chase. Consciousness does not respond to requests, it responds to identification. Everything you assume as true about yourself begins to express itself. It is not time that creates reality, it is the state you occupy now. The common mistake is believing you must change your life first, and then change your identity. Neville completely reverses this logic. First, you change the concept you hold of yourself, then life reorganizes itself. As long as you see yourself as someone in process, in lack, or in waiting, that will be your repeated experience. The world only mirrors the dominant inner state. The future self is not a distant fantasy. It is a version of you that already exists as a living possibility. The only difference between the current self and the desired self is the state of consciousness being occupied. When this becomes clear, external searching loses its power. A silent question appears and changes everything. Who would I be now if this were already true? This question does not ask for effort. It asks for inner honesty. As you begin to notice this difference in identity, you move closer to the core of Neville's teaching. It is not about imagining something happening, but recognizing who you would be if it had already happened. And this is exactly where most techniques fail. Why visualization alone is not enough. Many people visualize beautiful scenes for years and yet remain in the same place. They see images, repeat affirmations, and wait for results, but nothing changes consistently. The problem is not visualization itself, but the inner position of the one who visualizes. Usually, the person imagining still perceives themselves as someone who does not yet have. This keeps the desire active but unfulfilled. Visualizing from lack reinforces lack. When you imagine something desired but feel it is still distant, the feeling contradicts the image. Neville explains that consciousness does not respond to images. It responds to the felt state. What creates is the feeling of reality, not mental effort. Without this feeling, visualization becomes nothing more than inner entertainment. Another common mistake is treating imagination as an activity separate from identity. A person imagines for a few minutes and then returns to living exactly as before. This creates an inner division between the moment of the technique and the rest of the day. For Neville, this was never the way. Imagining is assuming a state, not visiting a scene. When the feeling does not change, the state does not change. And when the state does not change, reality remains consistent with it. This is why so many people say they know what to do, but see no results. They continue to feel the same, react the same way, and wait for the same external signs. Imagination must leave the mind and become identity. This understanding opens space for something deeper. If visualization is not sufficient, then what is truly missing in the process? The answer is not doing more, but being different. And this leads directly to the central point of Neville Goddard's approach. Neville Goddard and imagination as identity. Neville Goddard did not teach techniques in the common sense of the word. He taught a principle about identity and consciousness. For him, imagination is not a tool you use. It is the place from which you live. When you imagine correctly, you are not creating something new. You are occupying a state that already exists. This is the point that changes everything. Imagining, according to Neville, is stepping into the role of the person you desire to be. It is not observing that person from a distance. It is wearing that identity internally. When you do this, consciousness reorganizes itself naturally. There is no effort, no struggle, only recognition. External reality begins to follow this silent change. The problem is that most people imagine as spectators. They see scenes as if watching a movie. Neville teaches that you must be inside the scene, feeling yourself as the main character. This completely changes the experience. Imagination stops being passive and becomes lived. When imagination is lived, the body responds. There is a sense of normality, relief, and inner recognition. This is the sign that the state has been occupied. There is no forced excitement, only quiet certainty. This is the state that begins to express itself in the physical world. From here it becomes clear that the problem was never lack of faith or lack of technique. The problem was imagining without assuming. And assuming requires understanding a fundamental difference. Imagining is not seeing, it is being. Imagining is not seeing, it is being. There is a deep difference between imagining something happening and imagining from the place of someone who already lives it. In the first case, you remain the same person, only desiring something different. In the second, you shift the point of identity. Neville insists that all creation begins from where you imagine. This detail defines the outcome. When you imagine as someone who is still waiting, waiting continues. When you imagine as someone who already lives it, consciousness adjusts. There is no need to create complex or long scenes. Sometimes a simple feeling of normality is enough. What matters is who you are while imagining. Being is more important than doing. Many people want to know what to do to manifest, but ignore who they need to be. Neville teaches that being comes first, doing follows naturally. When the state changes, actions change without effort. You begin to act in ways that match the new self. This explains why forcing behaviors without changing the inner state creates exhaustion. You are trying to act like someone you are not yet internally. True alignment happens when the state changes first. From there, everything feels natural, almost obvious. This shift in identity creates a curious effect. The sense of time begins to lose importance. Urgency fades. Anxiety dissolves. And this is where Neville introduces something essential: the collapse of consciousness and the illusion of time. The collapse of consciousness and the end of waiting. When you occupy a new state, something subtle happens to your perception of time. Waiting no longer exists as tension. Neville explains that time is only the measure of how long you remain in a state. When you change the state, the time required for external change reorganizes itself. It is not acceleration, it is coherence. The desired future is not distant, it is inaccessible only while you occupy another state. By changing consciousness, you access that future now. This does not mean everything appears instantly in visible form. It means the process is already complete internally. The external simply follows. This understanding dissolves anxiety. You no longer need to search for signs or confirmations. The feeling of already having lived it creates a quiet peace. Neville calls this living in the end. It is not waiting for the end, it is living from it. This is the great shift. When you live from the end, effort decreases. The need to control the path disappears. You trust not because you believe, but because you recognize. The state has already been assumed, so there is nothing to ask for. There is only something to sustain internally. Sustaining this state requires clear identification, and it is exactly here that Neville introduces the most powerful principle of all. A principle simple yet deeply misunderstood. Its name is I am. I am, the name of the state that creates. Everything you say after I am defines the state you occupy. Neville treats this expression as the name of consciousness itself. It is not about magical words, but identification. When you say I am, you are declaring who you are being now, and consciousness responds to this inevitably. Many people use I am automatically, without realizing its impact. I am anxious, I am worried, I am forgetful, I am just like this. Each of these statements fixes a state. The repetition is not verbal, it is lived. You live according to what you assume yourself to be. Assuming a new I am does not require convincing anyone. It requires inner acceptance. Neville does not teach fighting the old state, but replacing it. When you assume a new state, the old one loses strength naturally. There is no confrontation, only displacement. This new I am must be felt as present, not as a future statement. It is not I will be, it is I am now. This subtle shift changes everything. The body responds, the mind adjusts, and reactions begin to change. External reality simply follows this silent command. But assuming a state is not about repeating phrases all day long. It is about feeling the reality of this new self, and this leads directly to the essential practice Neville teaches, the feeling of the wish fulfilled. The feeling of the wish fulfilled. Neville makes it clear that it is not emotional intensity that creates, but the sense of reality. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is simple, natural, and stable. It is the feeling of relief, of normality, of safety. It is like when something you wanted deeply finally happens and stops being a problem. This feeling does not need to last a long time. A few seconds lived with truth are more effective than long, empty practices. What matters is that, in that moment, you are not desiring, you are recognizing. The body understands this difference immediately. There is a clear inner relaxation. Imagination enters as support, not as the main actor. A small scene, a symbolic gesture, or even a simple thought can be enough. What matters is the feeling that accompanies it. When this feeling appears, you know the state has been accessed. There is no doubt, only recognition. After accessing this state, the work is not to repeat the technique, but to respect the state. Constantly returning to doubt breaks continuity. Neville teaches that loyalty to the state is more important than any exercise. Persistence is not forcing, it is not abandoning. And this persistence reveals itself in daily life, in reactions, choices, and spontaneous thoughts. This is where practice becomes life, and this is also where the challenges of the old self appear. Maintaining the state throughout the day. Maintaining the state does not mean being alert every moment. It means returning whenever you notice you have left it. The old state shows itself through automatic reactions, recurring fears, and controlling thoughts. Neville does not teach repressing this, but observing and choosing again. The choice is internal. Every reaction reveals where you are living from. When you react as someone who does not trust, you leave the state. When you respond as someone who already knows, you return. This movement becomes more natural with practice. There is no guilt, only adjustment. What Neville called the mental diet appears here as refinement, not obsessive vigilance. It is not about controlling thoughts, but about not identifying with them. Thoughts alone do not create, states create, and you choose the state you live from. Over time, the new state begins to stabilize. It becomes familiar, comfortable. The old one starts to feel strange, artificial. This is a clear sign of real change. The external world may not yet have fully reorganized, but internally everything has already shifted. And when the state changes, something important happens. Resistances begin to appear, not as enemies, but as echoes of the old self. Understanding this prevents silent self-sabotage. The old self and invisible resistance. The old self does not disappear all at once. It shows up as subtle doubts, impulses to control, and the need for confirmation. Neville teaches that this is not a problem. It is simply a mental habit losing strength. Resisting it gives it more energy. Recognizing it and letting it go is the path. When you try to control the how, you return to the old state. The need to know when, in what way, or through which path reveals insecurity. The state of the wish fulfilled does not need these answers. It lives in silent trust. This trust is not blind faith, it is inner coherence. Each time you notice the impulse to control, you have an opportunity. You can follow the old habit or return to the assumed state. This choice is intimate and silent. No one sees it, but it defines everything. This is how the state strengthens. Over time, the old self loses authority. It may still appear, but it no longer convinces. The new state becomes dominant. Decisions change, responses change, perception changes. You begin to live differently without feeling effort. And when this happens, life begins to respond in the same natural way. Not as magic, but as consequence. This is where Neville's plan reveals itself in motion. Living from the end, the plan in motion. Living from the end is not pretending something happened. It is recognizing internally that the state has already been assumed. From that point on, actions stop being attempts and become expressions. You act as someone who already is, not as someone who wants to become. This difference changes everything. Daily decisions begin to reflect the new self. Small choices align naturally. There is no conscious effort to change behavior. It simply changes. The environment begins to respond. People react differently. Opportunities arise unexpectedly. Everything follows the state. Neville never promised external control. He taught inner alignment. When alignment happens, the external follows in the necessary time. There is no rush because there is no lack. The state has already been occupied, so there is no urgency. There is only continuity. If you have come this far, a silent decision has already begun to form. And to strengthen this new state, write in the comments the phrase, "I already live in the state of my fulfilled life." When you write this, you are not asking for anything. You are declaring who you choose to be now. This declaration reinforces identity and stabilizes the state internally. Neville Goddard said that assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled is assuming the wish itself. When this is understood, the search ends and living begins. And from this point on, there is no return to the old state, only deeper embodiment of the new. This embodiment does not require constant repetition of words throughout the day. It requires sincerity of feeling. It is about allowing the reality of this new self to become familiar. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is not tension. It is release. It is the quiet sense that nothing is missing. Neville explains that when the feeling is real, the mind stops asking questions. There is no longer a need to check, to confirm, or to measure progress. The inner state settles. From that place, life begins to move on its own. The outer world rearranges without pressure, without struggle, without force. What once felt difficult begins to feel ordinary. What once felt distant begins to feel natural. This is how identity replaces effort. This is how the future becomes present. This embodiment does not require constant repetition of words throughout the day. It requires sincerity of feeling. It is about allowing the reality of this new self to become familiar, natural, almost obvious. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is not tension. It is release. It is the quiet sense that nothing is missing. Neville explains that when the feeling is real, the mind stops asking questions. There is no longer a need to check, to confirm, or to measure progress. The inner state settles, and from that place life begins to move on its own. The outer world rearranges without pressure, without struggle, without force. What once felt difficult begins to feel ordinary. What once felt distant begins to feel close and accessible. This is how identity replaces effort. This is how the future becomes present. Many people misunderstand this stage and believe they must constantly hold a strong emotion. Neville never taught emotional strain. He taught naturalness. When something is truly yours, you do not feel excited all the time. You feel stable. You feel grounded. You feel at ease. The feeling of the wish fulfilled carries this quality. It is quiet, calm, and steady. It does not shout. It does not rush. It does not beg for proof. It simply is. This is why Neville emphasized that the state must feel like home. When you enter the state and it feels familiar, the work is already done internally. At this point, imagination serves only as a reminder, not as labor. You do not imagine to make something happen. You imagine to return to who you already are. Sometimes this happens through a brief inner scene, sometimes through a simple shift in posture, sometimes through a thought that carries certainty. The form does not matter. The feeling does. When the feeling aligns, the state locks in place. And once the state is occupied, the law operates automatically. This is where many people unknowingly sabotage themselves. They access the state, feel the shift, and then immediately question it. They wonder if it worked, how long it will take, or what they should do next. These questions pull them back into the old identity. Neville teaches that after assuming the state, the most important thing is non-interference. You do not dig up a seed to see if it is growing. You allow it to unfold. Respecting the state means allowing it to be without constantly checking it. Living from the assumed state changes the way you respond to life. Situations that once triggered fear now feel neutral. Conversations that once created insecurity feel lighter. Decisions that once felt heavy become simple. This does not happen because you are forcing calm. It happens because your reference point has shifted. You are no longer reacting from lack. You are responding from sufficiency. Maintaining the state throughout the day is not about perfection. It is about awareness and return. The old state may still appear, especially in familiar environments or old patterns. Neville never suggested that the old self would disappear instantly. He explained that states are habits of consciousness, and habits dissolve through disuse. Each time you notice yourself slipping into the old identity and gently return to the assumed state, the new identity strengthens. There is no punishment, no failure, no reset. There is only redirection. The mental diet, often misunderstood, is not about policing thoughts. It is about choosing where you live from. Thoughts are reflections of states, not their cause. When you try to fight thoughts, you give them power. When you change the state, thoughts reorganize naturally. This is why Neville emphasized feeling over thinking. The feeling sets the tone. The thoughts follow. Over time, something subtle but profound happens. The new state begins to feel more real than the old one. The old reactions start to feel foreign, almost artificial. You notice them arise, but they no longer define you. They pass through without attachment. This is a clear sign that identity has shifted. Even if the external world has not fully caught up, internally the change is complete. And once the internal shift is complete, the external adjustment is inevitable. Resistance often appears at this stage, not as chaos, but as quiet doubt. You may feel an urge to control details, to plan outcomes, or to anticipate obstacles. Neville teaches that this urge is simply the old self-seeking relevance. It does not need to be confronted. It needs to be ignored. When you refuse to engage with the need to control, it weakens. When you return to the assumed state, it dissolves. The need to know how, when, or through whom something will happen is a clear signal that the state has been momentarily abandoned. The state of the wish fulfilled does not ask these questions. It rests in trust, not blind trust, but logical trust rooted in identity. If you already are, then the how is irrelevant. The path will arrange itself. This is why Neville consistently warned against manipulating circumstances. When you try to force the outer world, you are confessing that the inner world has not yet changed. True power is quiet. It moves without announcement. When the state is stable, actions arise naturally, without tension. You find yourself saying the right words, making the right choices, and being in the right places without planning it. Living from the end transforms action. Action no longer comes from desire, but from expression. You are not trying to get something, you are moving as someone who already has. This difference is subtle but absolute. It changes the quality of everything you do. Work becomes lighter. Relationships become clearer. Decisions become simpler. The world responds to this shift, not because it is magical, but because it is consistent. Reality mirrors identity. When identity stabilizes, reality aligns. Neville never promised instant results, but he promised faithful results. The delay people experience is not time, it is inconsistency of state. When the state remains occupied, the outcome is guaranteed. At this stage, urgency disappears. There is no race, there is no pressure. The absence of urgency is one of the strongest indicators that the state has been assumed. When you are no longer anxious for the result, it is already done internally. You continue living, not waiting. You continue choosing, not hoping. If you have reached this point in understanding, something has already shifted. Even reading these words from the right place reinforces the state. And reinforcing the state is not about repetition. It is about recognition. Each moment you recognize yourself as the one who already is, the state deepens. Neville summarized this entire process in one simple instruction. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and persist in it. Persist does not mean struggle. It means remain faithful. Faithfulness is loyalty to identity. When you remain loyal to who you have assumed yourself to be, life has no choice but to reflect it. This is not philosophy. This is practice lived quietly. No one needs to know. No one needs to approve. The transformation happens within and reveals itself without announcement. And once you live from this place, you realize there was never a future to reach. There was only a state to occupy. And this is where the journey gently comes to rest. Not because something ends, but because something stabilizes. When the state is truly assumed, there is no longer a sense of searching. You are no longer moving toward life. Life is moving through you. The questions that once felt urgent lose importance. The need to prove, to check, to confirm, quietly dissolves. What remains is a simple way of being. Neville taught that creation is finished, and your role is not to make something happen, but to select where you live from. When you finally understand this, effort drops away. You stop trying to become and start allowing yourself to be. The state you once desired becomes your natural reference point. You wake up inside it. You respond from it. You make choices from it without thinking. At this point, the outer world no longer feels like an obstacle. Circumstances are no longer interpreted as tests or delays. They are seen as movements, adjustments, echoes catching up. You do not resist them, and you do not chase them. You remain where you are internally, and everything else reorganizes around that center. This is the quiet power Neville spoke about. Not control, not force, not struggle, but alignment. Alignment between who you know yourself to be and how life unfolds. When this alignment is present, life feels cooperative. Even challenges lose their sharpness because they are no longer taken personally. They pass, they adjust, they resolve. The old self, the one who lived in waiting, gradually fades into memory. It no longer defines you. It may still whisper from time to time, but it has no authority. You recognize it as a habit that no longer fits. And without conflict, without drama, you let it go. What remains is a stable sense of self, a quiet confidence. Not confidence based on outcomes, but confidence rooted in identity. You trust not because everything is perfect, but because you know where you are living from. And that knowing is enough. Neville often reminded his students that the feeling of the wish fulfilled is the secret, not as a technique, but as a way of life. When you live from fulfillment, life reflects fulfillment. When you live from wholeness, life mirrors wholeness. There is no other work to be done. From this place, you no longer look ahead hoping to arrive. You recognize that arrival already happened the moment you assume the state. Everything that follows is simply the unfolding of that assumption. And when this becomes clear, deeply clear, the cycle completes. Desire turns into identity. Waiting turns into presence. The future turns into now.